Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today on race, ethnicity, and disability, the financial impact of systemic inequality and intersectionality. Next slide, please. My name is Michael Rausch, and I'm the Director for the Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development at the National Disability Institute. Before we get started, we would like to go over some housekeeping tips. Next slide, please. Listening to the webinar. The audio for today's meeting can be accessed using computer audio or by calling in by phone. If you select computer audio, please make sure your speakers are turned on or your headphones are plugged in. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer or prefer to listen by phone, please dial 1-929-205-6099 and enter the meeting code 856-2838-9937. Next slide, please. Captioning. Real-time captioning is provided during this webinar. The captions can be found by clicking on the CC button in your Zoom controls at the bottom of the screen. If you do not see the captions after clicking the button, please alert the host via the chat box. You may also view captions in your browser at /EVENT=NDI. Next slide, please. Submitting questions. Please use the Q&A box to submit any questions you have during the webinar, and we will direct them accordingly. If your question is not answered during the webinar, or you are listening by phone and not logged in, you may email my colleague, Hope Price, at hprice@ndi-inc.org. Technical assistance. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box to send a message to the NDI host or email Hope Price at hprice@ndi-inc.org. Please note, this webinar is being recorded and the materials will be placed on the National Disability Institute website at nationaldisabilityinstitute.org, and you'll click on resources and click on webinars. Next slide, please. Great. So with today's presentation and discussion, first of all, we're going to provide an overview of the Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development and the National Disability Institute. Then the webinar will provide an overview of the racial wealth divide, as well as highlight data, specifically looking at the economic inequality on the intersection of race, disability, ethnicity, and disability. In addition to sharing some information, providing an overview of the racial wealth divide, looking at disability-specific data on this topic and the intersectionality, we then will have a panel discussion, which I will introduce shortly, that will be addressing a variety of questions that have come in, as well as we'll be addressing the questions that you have. So reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we can see how many we can get answered. Then we'll close out our webinar and share some next steps. Next slide. So for those of you who are new to the National Disability Institute, we are a national nonprofit organization that is dedicated to building a better economic future for people with disabilities. NDI is the first national organization committed exclusively to championing economic empowerment, financial education, asset development, and financial stability for all persons with disabilities. At NDI, we affect change through public education, policy development, training, technical assistance, and innovative initiatives. Please visit our website at www.nationaldisabilityinstitute.org. The next slide, please. So at the National Disability Institute, NDI manages and houses the Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development. The Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development is working to build the awareness that people with disabilities are part of all communities, and the needs of the disability community need to be a part of community development activities. Next slide, please. So disability inclusive community development, and just to share with you a little bit, is assuring that all are included in activities that promote the well-being of a community. This may include enhancing affordable housing, workforce development, and building the financial knowledge of low and moderate income individuals with and without disabilities. We believe that an inclusive community development approach assures that the well-being of all is the focus. To learn more about the Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development, you can go to cdicd.org. Next slide, please. So I'm grateful to welcome Denise Steele, who is with JP Morgan Chase, and JP Morgan Chase is a supporter of this webinar, as well as one of the founding funders of the Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development. Denise, actually, a little background, was one of the founding work group members of the Center for Disability Community Development, who works tirelessly to help guide the work of the center. So we're very excited, Denise, to have you join us, and would like to give you a moment to say hello and give a welcome.
Thank you, Michael, for that very, very nice introduction. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I would also like to thank you all today for joining today's webinar. My name is Denise Steele, and I'm part of JP Morgan Chase's Corporate Responsibility Community Engagement team. Our work includes collaborating with nonprofit and community-based organizations, such as the National Disability Institute, to support these type of platforms, to share tools and resources that drives inclusive economic growth and opportunity across all spectrums. We are excited to be able to share this unique convening with you today. And our hope is the information presented will be of value to you. Here at JP Morgan Chase, disability inclusion represents our deep commitment and rich history to creating a workplace that respects all for their unique skills, backgrounds, and professional experiences. During this time in particular in our history, the intersectionality of disability with gender, racial, and ethnic identities drives home all the more need for fairness, equity, and equality. As a firm, we strive to ensure that individuals with disabilities, employees, and customers can thrive and do business respectively under a cultural mindset that is disability inclusive. Some of our work includes providing our managers and team leaders with the resources to recruit, hire, and advance employees with disabilities. Our Autism at Work initiative, which is one of the firm's fastest growing hiring initiatives. And then last, our BEST program, which really focuses on recruiting and integrating people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which you will hear more about in the panel discussion later on in the webinar. But again, I say thank you for joining. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Michael.
Great, thank you, Denise, and thank you for your support of the work that we're doing and the work that you and JP Morgan Chase are doing to assure the full inclusion of individuals with disabilities. Thank you. Next slide. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to share with you that I think you are going to really enjoy our various presenters and our panel discussion today. You're in for a real treat that we have Lillian Singh, who's the Vice President of Programs and Racial Equity at Prosperity Now. She's going to be sharing with us and kind of laying the foundation for us on what racial wealth inequality is, and to really lay the foundation of the racial wealth divide. I shared this with Lillian before, but I had, prior to us meeting, I had watched a couple podcasts she had done and other webinars, and she's an amazing presenter and has a wonderful story, and a great treat for us to have her with us to be able to lay the foundation. So Lillian, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And I would like to thank NDI as well as JP Morgan Chase for bringing this critical conversation and discussion to this platform. I am thankful to be in community with all of you today. And I know a lot of the data that I'm going to share may be a little bit daunting, but the work that I do at Prosperity Now is to really help drive inclusionary efforts across sectors as well as at the community level, so that more people have an opportunity to effectively engage in an equitable economy. I will drop in at the end of this presentation some additional resources about how you might be able to stay engaged with some of our research as well as our programs and practices. And I am again thankful to be in community with each and every one of you this afternoon. Next slide, please. So as Michael mentioned, I am going to be talking about racial wealth inequality, an overview of the causes and consequences. Next slide, please. I think it's very important for us to all have the same working definition of wealth. At Prosperity Now, specifically through the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, we define wealth as what an individual earn plus what they own minus what they owe becomes their wealth portfolio. Next slide, please. And to move up the wealth building ladder, it's critical for us to understand that a lot of Americans, in fact, 63% of Americans are liquid asset poor, which means that they live at a level of poverty in their communities. The next level of poverty as you move up this wealth ladder is really important for us to think about income. With an earned income, one is able to acquire assets such as cars, homes, and education. Assets oftentimes, depending on a person's level of income, comes with a level of debt. And once a person may be in a position to acquire that asset, the income oftentimes does not position them to actually build wealth. In 2018, Prosperity Now released a report entitled Ever-Growing Gap. In this report, we began to demonstrate that the average Black family wealth continues to grow. If the average Black family wealth continues to grow at the same pace it has over the past 3 decades, it would take Black families 242 years to amass the same amount of wealth as white families have today. That is just 3 years shorter than the 245-year span of slavery of African Americans in this country. We continue to disaggregate the data, and what we found as it relates to the Latino community and Latino families, it would take 94 years to amass the same amount of wealth for white families have today. And that year of parity is 2097. Next slide, please. It's important to understand how we got here. Next slide, please. So what we believe is that it's really important to name that the foundation of racial inequality is racialized economic inequality. And the foundation of economic inequality is wealth inequality. So we can't talk about bridging wealth if we want to ignore the legacy of discrimination has had on the impact of every single person's dimension of family wealth building, particularly families of color. These two pictures are used to demonstrate that the oppression from the very beginning of Native Americans on their land and African Americans' labor was motivating factors for this country. Many of the actions of our white forefathers of this country were driven by capitalism, not race. It's an economic and political system that has been built on ownership of capital goods for profit. So I think it's really important for us to see that in the beginning of times, the foundation of economic inequality wasn't necessarily racialized, it was capitalism. Next slide, please. When things began to get better in our country, and this would be in the mid-1930s, on the heels of America's first safety net, the cards were stacked against people of color from the very beginning. They were systematically excluded from one of America's first safety net programs, the Social Security Act of 1935. This is where we know that a third of all American workers, including farm workers and domestic workers, were predominantly people of color, and they were excluded from this first benefit. When we do the math today for African Americans, the cost of this exclusion has resulted in a loss benefiting over $143 billion. And this was 2016 numbers. Then there was a mass investment at the same time of this exclusion to the creation of what we see today of the white middle class. Next slide, please. During this same time period, what we saw after World War II was a release of the GI Bill rights, which assisted veterans with housing, education, and jobs, another federal institutional program. Between 1944 and 1971, we spent $95 billion on these benefits, but it was left to the states to administer these benefits. And what we saw in history is that Black veterans and other veterans of color were disproportionately denied access to these benefits. They were denied access to low-cost home mortgages, denied access to low-interest business loans, denied access to banks willing to lend credit to them. And most importantly, one of the foundations of what we believe is the driver of stabilization in a country is education. What we know from the data is that people of color, specifically Blacks, were denied access to tuition assistance to attend and integrate in some of our American institutions. Next slide. In addition, what we should also name is that we experience federally sanctioned housing discrimination. From 1968 to 1934, the federal government gave away 246 million acres in land, nearly 10% of all the land in the nation, to more than 1.5 million white families. Historian Merritt notes that this 46 million Americans adults today, nearly 20% of those American adults descended from those homesteaders. So let me be clear. The land that folks own in America today is a direct descendant of this free land that was given disproportionately to white families. And the other thing that was happening during this same time, unfortunately, is that the federal housing policies created by our Federal Housing Association, FHA, created after the Great Depression, further ensured that African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities that were built and instead pushed into urban housing projects. Despite their goal of making homeownership available, their goal, FHA, to more American households, these underwriting policies practices, which were implemented in its first 35 years, resulted in homeowners of color receiving just 2% of the government-backed mortgages. Ultimately, this practice not only set the stage for homeownership disparities that we see today, but became the largest driver of the racial wealth divide in assets and in wealth creation for Americans. Next slide, please. The legacy and this current consequences is seen today in every one of our communities. Next slide. This history matters for contemporary inequality because we have to understand where we've been if we're going to create solutions for the future. The legacy that was passed down to generation disproportionately has benefited white families and disproportionately put communities and families of color at a disadvantage. And as I go through 5 major indicators of economic prosperity, we're going to see these differences: income, employment, housing, and education. Next slide, please. As you can see on this slide, wealth, not income, is the means to security in America. Wealth, assets, and investments minus debts, as I described previously, enables us to buy homes in safer communities, to go to better schools, to go to better hospitals, to actually be in communities that is less policed and less criminalized. Arguably, income is one of the major drivers of wealth creation. Higher paying jobs or business organization lead to savings and asset accumulation. The disparities between Black and Latino households and white households is stark. White households in America today make roughly $76,000 annually, compared to $56,000 for Latino families and $46,000 for Black families. When we look at the intersectionality of gender, as Denise talked about earlier, Black women make less than white women, 61 cents on the dollar compared to white colleagues, and women of color make even less, at about 50 cents on the dollar. So we know that in addition to racial disparities with income, we need to be clear that there are also gender disparities with relation to income. And women of color experience racial and gender disparities at higher rates of unemployment and lower wages at every level of education, irrespective of occupation. Next slide, please. So we pulled some numbers just to try to see where we are right now on the heels of a worldwide pandemic as it relates to employment. What we were able to see, just numbers from last month, Black and Latino families continue to face the highest levels of job loss, with an unemployment rate approaching 10%, much higher than the overall population at 6%. Why? What's behind this? Let's clarify. Documented research of racial discrimination hiring practices and occupational segregation is the cause. White Americans disproportionately also benefit from being in labor unionized jobs and are less likely to be frontline workers. And as a result, during this pandemic, a lot of their jobs have been sheltered. And I want to name an important point, also the retirement levels. And finally, on average, Black workers experience higher rates of employment at every level of education and lower wages at every level of education. And what we know based off of research conducted by Dr. Kilo Kizi Kazi, this is in every single occupation. Next slide, please. When we consider another indicator of wealth building, we have to look at the homeownership rate. A lot of us are focused on homeownership as an opportunity for wealth building, but the homeownership rate for white households is 76% compared to 46% for Black and 51% for Latinos. And I want us to connect the dots here. This is directly related to income disparities. Remember that very first slide. You cannot build an asset or buy an asset such as becoming an homeowner if your overall income level is substantially lower. And that's why we see these great disparities in homeownership rates. In addition, Black homeowners have a mortgage denial rate, racial discrimination, that's nearly 13%, over double that of the overall denial rate for other races. And this data was pulled since last year, October. 5%, given the pandemic, 5% of white homeowners were behind on the mortgage payments, while 10% of Blacks and 12% of Latinos. And I want to name that this too was connected to the disproportionate impact that the pandemic had on the unemployment rates for communities of color. Next slide, please. And one of the things, if you all hear anytime me speaking about education, it's not the great equalizer. I want to name that because though we live in a country where segregation in schools is now banned, we don't have laws forcing segregated housing or segregated communities. So unfortunately, what we see is that these communities are still segregated, irrespective of the fact that it is no longer a mandate by law. But the way our school systems are funded, because of this legacy of housing segregation, Black children are more likely to attend poorly funded schools. And research tells us that public school education leaves a funding gap of about $23 billion between majority white schools and Black school districts. And this has a direct impact on the type, quality, and level of education that students of color receive. When you go further, and if you're not as lucky as me to actually have gone to Stanford to receive a free ride because I grew up in poverty, I graduated with no student loan debt. But I should not be a unicorn. That should be the standard. But most of my peers, unfortunately, graduate with college debt roughly about $100,000 a year. And those same Black peers, those same Latino peers, unfortunately, earn $75,000 a year on average, and they spend their entire careers looking to catch up and get out of student loan debt. Nationally, about 25% of whites have a bachelor's degree, while 15% of, nationally, about 25% of whites have a bachelor's degree, while 15% of Blacks and 12% of Latinos. But what we have seen through the research, through my colleague, Derek Hamilton at the New School, education is not the great equalizer when it comes to wealth creation and generation. And this is because Black college-educated households who lead homes are less likely to have the same level of wealth as a family household with a high school diploma. Next slide, please. So these statistics around all these indicators, income, employment, homeownership, and education. The question then is, Lillian, why do you even do this work? Like, it seems so daunting. I do this work because I am a living testament that public-private partnerships working together for the good can really transform America. So I hold on to that truth in my role at Prosperity Now. One of the things that I think that you all can think about doing is to further educate yourself, truly understand the data, get beneath the statistics at the community level, begin to partner and identify opportunities to champion solutions with local grassroots advocates in your local town halls. Be in the halls of your town halls. Be in the coalition meetings with folks on the ground who are really trying to think about solutions at the local level, because I believe those solutions are truly created at the local level. And then they are then risen to the top by popular vote and voices coming together to truly advocate. So that is why I stay committed to this work, because I believe that we are currently identifying those challenges. We are developing those solutions at the local level, at the city level, at the state level. We now have the political will, I believe, at the federal level to truly begin to advocate for policy and procedures to lean deeply into changes to address the racial wealth divide. Next slide, please. I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Great, Lillian, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful information and laying the foundation for it. We have been receiving some wonderful comments and some great questions have come in. And just to reiterate that this information will be available, the recording will be available. Again, Lillian, thank you so much. I think one of the key pieces is I was frantically taking some notes here, but one of the key pieces in your last slide about get beneath the data at the local level, and then it moves up. You know, our colleagues, our mutual colleagues, I think at Policy Links say local leaders are national leaders. And I think that that's really key when it comes to this topic of, you know, as you say, put it better than anyone else about get beneath the data at the local level. So thank you, Lillian. And we will ask you some questions that have come in next. Great. So next up, you're in for another treat. Well, first of all, didn't I say that Lillian was a great presenter, right? So you're going to have to be sure to go and check out some of our other webinars and podcasts. But now you're in for another treat because we have Nanette Goodman, who's the Director of Research at Burton Blatt Institute and Syracuse University. You might know Nanette because she was at the National Disability Institute and worked on this. And Nanette is amazing at being able to share data and share with us solutions. And so you're in for a special treat. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nanette, who's going to share more about the research at the National Disability Institute regarding the intersectionality of identities. Nanette, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you for joining us, Nanette.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Lillian, for giving us that that nice background to what I'm going to be talking about. So what we did is, oh, next slide. Oh, that's my intro. So I'm going to be talking about race, ethnicity, and disability, and the impact of the intersectionality of those three identities. Next slide. So we looked at data from multiple sources, and we found this very persistent set of disparities, regardless of the variables we were looking at. Like Lillian, we looked at education and income and wealth, and we consistently found that people with disabilities are in far worse financial situations than people without disabilities, and that Black and BIPOC Americans are in a worse financial position than white Americans, like Lillian just laid out. And these two things come as no surprise. You know we've been talking about both of these divides for many years, but what happens when we put these two things together and we look at people with and without disabilities by race and ethnicity? And here, when I talk about ethnicity, I mean Latinx. What we find is that Black Americans face an even harder economic reality than that Black Americans with disabilities face an even harder economic reality than either Black Americans without disabilities or non-Black Americans with disabilities. And I'll show you some data points in a minute. So why do we see this? At first, when I started looking at this, I thought what we were seeing is sort of these overlapping inequalities, right? We talk a lot about inequalities by race and inequalities by disability, and that what we were really seeing is that it was this matter of putting all the systemic issues facing people with disabilities on top of all the issues that Lillian just talked about facing Black Americans, and we get these even more dramatic differences. But as we talked with people, we realize that it's more nuanced than this, that BIPOC Americans with disabilities face a unique systemic challenge as a result of their intersecting identities. And it's these challenges that are at the root of what we call intersectionality. Like Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality when talking about the experience of Black women. But the issue here is similar, that it's not just a layering of the systemic challenges, and this is the way she put it, it's the inequalities that operate together and exacerbate each other. So what does this look like in real life? I'm guessing many of you have stories, and I'm hoping that others will bring them up maybe at the end. But for the most part, I'm going to be talking about the data here, but let me just give you one example. So we know that students with disabilities fare very differently in the special education process, and that only some of it has anything to do with the child's actual strengths and needs. We hear all the time about the low expectations that schools set for children with disabilities. We hear all the time about the low expectations that schools set for Black children, but this issue of low expectations is even more problematic for Black children with disabilities. And of course, don't get me started on how the system may see the root causes of behavioral issues differently. While white children may be seen as, oh, the behavioral issue is caused by their disability, a Black child may be, oh, he's just misbehaving or she's just misbehaving. So this leads us to where we are today, and helps us. And the goal here is to start thinking about how are we going to recover from the current economic devastation, and how are we going to make sure these inequalities are not magnified even more. So next slide. And I want to do some level setting just for a second. When we talk about the term disability, we may all be thinking about something slightly different. The data I'm going to be presenting is based on large national surveys, the American Community Survey, the American Housing Survey, and the Current Population Survey. They all use the same set of 6 questions to identify disability. Do you have serious difficulty hearing? Are you blind or have serious difficulty seeing because of a physical, mental, or emotional condition? Do you have serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions? Do you have serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs? Do you have difficulty dressing or bathing? And because of a physical, mental, or emotional condition, do you have difficulty doing errands alone, such as visiting a doctor's office or shopping? Respondents who answer yes to any one of those questions are considered to have a disability in the data. And if they answer no to those, they're considered, so that's considered to not have a disability, and that's the way we do the comparison. And we know these questions aren't perfect. We know that that we're capturing some people with significant psychosocial disabilities, but we're probably not capturing them all. But we're going to recognize right off the bat that disability is a complex concept. It's difficult to capture in a small number of questions. And what we're looking at tells us a story that's very important to understand, but I'm not going to show you things out to the 10th decimal place, because there's a lot of error in are we talking, is it 21%, is it 22%? We don't really know, but we know that sort of the general magnitude of the differences that we're seeing. So next slide. So first I want to look at poverty. So what we find is that the poverty rate for people with disabilities overall, and that's the last set of bars on the chart, is 26% compared with 11% for people without disabilities. But there are further disparities by race. 23% of white Americans with disabilities live in poverty, compared to 36% of Black Americans. More than 1 in 3 Black Americans with disabilities live in poverty. And these percentages mirror the percentages by race. So Black Americans are more likely to live in poverty. Black Americans with disabilities are even more likely to live in poverty. We often say that disability is both a cause and a consequence of poverty. A cause because it may affect your ability to fully participate in the labor market, to work consistently at high levels, but it's also a consequence. And I think this goes back to a little bit of what Lillian was talking about. It's people who lack access to medical care or supports to avoid the functional impairments that may come with chronic conditions, or that may not be able to access good medical care. We see it all the time. People who have hard lives, dangerous jobs, inadequate housing, there's a physical and psychological impact of that can be disabling. And we see, so when we look at poverty, we're seeing both sides of this equation. It's people in poverty being more likely to have a disability, and people with a disability more likely to be living in poverty. So this data really reflects the daily lives of people with disabilities. Unfortunately, it distills it down into something that's not very personal. Even if we use like really cool graphics, we can't begin to identify and describe what financial fragility looks like and what its impact is on people's personal lives, their mental health, and their ability to fully participate in society. Remember, here we're presenting averages. We've come a long way in the last 30 years. There are people with disabilities who are doing economically just fine, but for many, especially BIPOC individuals with disabilities, the economic situation is dire. So when we're looking at poverty, let me just remember the poverty threshold, the income below which we consider a person to be living in poverty, is $12,760 for an individual living alone. The threshold varies by household size, but for example, the threshold is $26,200 for a family of 4. 1/3 of Black and Latinx people with disabilities are living in poverty. 1 in 4 people with disabilities in general are living in poverty. Many of these people do receive public benefits like food stamps, Medicaid, or housing subsidies that aren't included in this statistic, but it's still dire. By the way, disability cash benefits are counted. So even after, these poverty statistics are even after we account for SSI and SSDI. So I just really want to talk, just let it sink in for 1 minute, what it means to have more than 1/3 of a community living in poverty. Next slide. And this also follows up on what Lillian was talking about. She had mentioned the disparity in educational attainment between Black and white Americans. And again, we can intersect that with race. 41% of white Americans without disabilities have a bachelor's degree or higher. compared to 17% of those without a disability. I'm sorry, I think I got that one backwards. Let me start that one over. So individuals with disabilities have lower levels of educational attainment within each racial and ethnic group. And all racial and ethnic minority groups have lower levels of educational attainment when you compare them to non-Hispanic white individuals. So when you intersect them, what you get is that while 41% of non-Hispanic white individuals without a disability have a bachelor's degree or higher, only 17% of those with a disability have a bachelor's degree or higher, and only 11% of Black individuals with a disability have a bachelor's degree or higher. These are really stark differences. And because educational attainment is such an important factor in employment and income, the lower levels of education among adults with disabilities, and especially among BIPOC adults with disabilities, has a significant impact on economic outcomes. And I say that, you know, actually tipping a hat to Lillian's point that the returns on education are not as great for African Americans or people with disabilities. We have research that says even among those who go to college, people with disabilities are less likely to get good jobs with that education. So, you know, these are really, really systemic issues that come out when we look at the data. Next slide. So we know that people with disabilities have been hard hit by COVID. We've had, you know, a disproportionate number of cases of COVID, and deaths occurred in congregate living situations. We heard stories about people with disabilities being triaged away from care because of somebody else's assessment of their quote quality of life. Some of our disability lawyers worked overtime to make sure states didn't set up healthcare rationing priorities that discriminated against people with disabilities. People who needed regular care weren't able to consistently get it. You know, some of those issues eased over time, but we're still hearing about them now. In terms of the economic impact, you know, what we just talked about was that many people with disabilities, and BIPOC people with disabilities in particular, didn't have the economic resources to be able to weather the storm. And from a data perspective, we'll be learning about that impact in years to come. Unfortunately, while we had some good data sources for people without disabilities and by race over the course of the pandemic, we didn't have such great data about the impact on people with disabilities. The one area that we were able to track month by month was the employment situation. And what we find is that people with disabilities have lower employment rates than people without disabilities overall. And on this graph, the lines at the top, the dotted lines at the top is the employment rate of people without disabilities, and the solid lines on the bottom are the employment rate of people with disabilities. And African Americans, both with and without disabilities, had started off having lower employment rates than people with disabilities in the same racial groups. But what was really striking is what happened at the beginning of the pandemic. Between March and April, you know, when the employment rate plummeted for everybody, but the employment rate really plummeted for African Americans, Latinx, and Latinx folks. And for African Americans with disabilities, almost 1/3 of people who were working in March were not working by May. I mean, this was like huge impacts. We've had many of the jobs have been recovered with this time series only goes through September. Many of the jobs have been recovered, but not all of them. But sort of that disparate impact of the pandemic, it could, it's really interesting. When you play with data all the time, when you see something so clearly in data that is going on in real life, it's kind of it's you kind of think, well, there's something to this data, and this really points out exactly what happened. And I think Lillian talked about why that is. The difference in the kinds of jobs that people had, that whites and people without disabilities were in jobs that were more protected from the pandemic. So that's the impact of employment. You can go to the next slide. So now let's talk about net worth. And Lillian really laid it out well, that net worth is your income plus your assets minus your expenditures and your debt, and that gives you the net, and that gives you a net worth. And we heard about the racial disparity in net worth, and we see, and we also know that there's this disparity between people with and without disabilities. So in this chart, we're looking at the household net worth by race, ethnicity, and disability, where that based on the disability status of the householder. And we're just looking at those who are of working age. We hear a lot in the press about how the net worth of white households is 10 times that of Black households. And what we found is that the average net worth of a white household without a disability is around $130,000. And the net worth of a white household with a disability is around $27,000. So there's a really stark difference. But Black households with a disability have a net worth of $1,282. This is compared to the average net worth of a Black family with these, with a working age householder of $14,321. So this is nothing short of shocking when we think about whether people could draw on their savings to weather the economic impact of a disaster like COVID. So I just want to keep that up for a second, because having a net worth of $1,282, and remember, this is an average. That means many people are below that number. Many people are above, but many people are below. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So we also looked at housing, and we looked at the percentage of people who are severely cost burdened. And cost burden means that you spend 30% or more of your income on housing, and severely cost burdened is that you spend 50% or more of your income on housing. And what we find is that 1/3 of Black and Latinx households with a household member with a disability are severely cost burdened. That means they spend more than half of their income on housing. This is much higher than white households, where 23% of households with a disability and 14% of those without a disability are cost burdened. But cost burden severely cost burden is an issue for many populations, but even more of an issue for Black families, and especially Black families with a disability. So you can go to the next slide. So what we find is that, so there's another issue that I really want to bring up. And this is, we've been talking a lot about the income side of the equation. But as Lillian pointed out, wealth is income, assets, and also expenditures. And I want to talk a little bit about the expenditure side of the equation for people with disabilities, right? We know people with disabilities are less likely to be employed and then less likely to have income from wages. On average, they have lower wages than those without disabilities, and they're more likely to live in poverty. But poverty is measured based solely on income, and eligibility for means-tested public programs is predominantly based on the income side of the equation. These income measures don't consider the expenses or the additional out-of-pocket costs associated with living with a disability. As a result, they understate the true level of economic hardships for households that include a person with a disability. The next slide. So what are we talking about when we're talking about out-of-pocket costs? These are personal assistance services, extra healthcare costs, extra costs of housing that's accessible and convenient. It's more expensive to buy a car that can accommodate modifications. You have to maintain service animals. The list goes on and on and on. And there's actually two hashtags, disability tax and crip tax, where people are just sort of talking about these extra out-of-pocket costs. There are things that we're already capturing when we're talking about the disparity in income, right? So we know that households that have a person with a disability, often either the person with a disability or some other family member may need to reduce their amount of work to provide care or support. And we know about the foregone earnings for the person with a disability. Those are already included when we talk about income, but these other things, these direct out-of-pocket costs, aren't included in any of our discussions when we're talking about the financial status and financial fragility of people with disabilities. Next. So working with folks at Stony Brook University and the University of Kentucky, we used a statistical approach, and we found that a household containing a working age person with a disability requires 28% more income to have the same standard of living as a similar household without a member with a disability. This means that for somebody at the median income level, they would need to spend about an extra $17,690 a year to reach the same standard of living as a household without a disability. We didn't find statistically meaningful differences by race, but I think there really is a racial component here. I think one of the striking things, and I'm going to thank the advocates that Donna, who we'll hear from later, works with for some of these stories. So when we talked to some folks in Detroit, and they talked about what these extra costs look like, and how that's affected by race. So think about two families, each need to put rails in their bathroom. If you own the home, you either do it yourself or you have a contractor, you install the rails, within a couple of weeks it's done. If you rent the home, and this goes back to Lillian's presentation about redlining, you go through this time-consuming process, many hoops, to be able to ultimately install the rail and probably pay extra. And what happens if you're living in a low-income, predominantly Black neighborhood where the housing stock is pretty old, and you become a wheelchair user? the folks in Detroit described it that you need to move to the suburbs. You need to move to a more expensive neighborhood away from your support system, because that's where there's newer housing stock with wheelchair accessible buildings and elevators. So there's a racial component even to these extra costs. We haven't captured that in data yet, but we expect to at some point. We can go to the next slide. But what we did do is we looked at what would happen if you adjusted the federal poverty level for the extra cost of disability. And what we find is that the rate of poverty among people with disabilities would increase substantially. We estimated that about 2.2 million more people with disabilities would be counted as poor if we adjusted the poverty level. And that if we included these extra costs, this would expand eligibility for many health and public benefit programs. Next slide. And I think many people have seen this slide about the difference between equity and equality, where equality is where everybody gets the same size box. But that still leaves some people not being able to see the baseball game, where equity is where everybody is given the kinds of supports they need to be able to participate fully. And if you want to read some of our reports, you can go to nationaldisabilityinstitute.org/reports, and we have reports on race and disability, and we also have our reports on extra costs.
Great, thank you, Nanette. Thank you so much for sharing this important information with us and with our audience. What we want to do now is we want to spend the next few minutes having our panel members react to the information that was shared and then begin to address some of the questions. We've gotten a lot of questions in the chat box and via email, which we greatly appreciate. So I think we're going to have to do a 2.0 to get to some of those great questions. But we're fortunate to have a panel discussion, a group of panelists with us. We have Donna Coulter, who's the Member Engagement Administration at Customer Service Department at the Detroit Wayne Integrated Health Network that Nanette had mentioned. We also have Tom Stokes, who's the former Regional Manager, Community Affairs, Atlanta Region Division, Depositor and Consumer Protection at FDIC. And most importantly, I would like to say is that he, along with Janet Hamer, helped formulate or put together the idea of the Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development and co-chairs our work group. So definitely is a leader within creating and moving forward CDICD. And we also have Brian Gill, who's the Operations Director of Business Solutions Team BEST at JP Morgan Chase that Denise had mentioned. You know, as we go into our panel discussion here, I'd like to start off by each of you briefly just sharing a little bit about your organization or some of the work you're doing, but then also just share one or two of your initial reactions to some of the information that was shared today. Donna, we could start with you.
Sure. Thank you for having me here today. This is a great conversation and worthy of having more like this. My organization, Detroit Wayne Integrated Health Network, serves more than 70,000 individuals. These are individuals who have developmental disabilities, serious mental illness, substance use disorder. We serve children and adults, as well as we include in that group individuals who have autism as well. So what stood out to me, and there's just so much from our two great speakers here, but the idea of financial fragility really stands out for me in how that is related to individuals having a disability. When it comes to those folk and their financial means, I also think about some of the resources they have available to them. And many of those folk tend to be unmarried. They tend to be single. they tend to not have children, which, when I think of it, is also a type of resource or a type of wealth builder. You have children, they're able to expand the family, they're able to bring resources into the fold, and people with disabilities tend not to be in those situations. They also tend to have fewer natural relationships. And so that rail that Nanette mentioned, if it needs to be, if you're a homeowner, then you arrange for a repair. If you are a renter, then you have to go through a system where you get someone in. When you have means, you have natural relationships, maybe you can call over that friend who has the tools that you would be able to use in order to repair that rail. And so I think about the combination of the financial resources lacking, as well as some of those natural resources that will become available as a result of having more people available in your lives, such as a partner or children or friendships. So I'll leave it there. I know we have limited time.
Great. Thank you, Donna. Excellent point. Tom, I'll turn it to you for your reaction.
I was struck by the fact.
Perfect.
I was struck by
I can
the
hear
fact,
you. Great.
Yeah, I was struck by the fact that Lillian had given that overview of saying that if the trend lines continued for wealth building, that the gap wouldn't be overcome until 242 years. That was striking to me, because I actually was thinking in terms of generational strategies, but looking at that timeline, that's a major issue. So that's striking in of itself. So we definitely need to continue the conversation. And I agree that the conversation needs to be amped up, particularly at the local level. I think that's the key. We need to continue to talk about it at national and state levels, but we need to figure out ways for us to continue that discussion at that community level, both rural and urban, because it's so key to making sure that everyone understands not only the data, but what underlies that. And very quickly, I was able to go back to my college experience, and I had everything paid for up until the final semester, my senior year. My wife went to the same school, but she had extensive uh, college debt because she wasn't able to cobble together the various scholarships that I was. And I'm thinking that goes back to the resource levels of our respective schools that we went to. She didn't have the resource and the access to the resource at her school to identify other scholarships that I had. So obviously the race issue was a component there, but I also think that the resource that was available because of the underfunded school that my wife attended, that it made that an impractical situation for her to be able to also go through without a substantial college debt. And I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Tom, and thank you for sharing that story. Brian, we'll go to you next for your initial reaction.
Thank you, Michael. So just real quick introduction, the Business Solutions team is our firm-wide initiative to expand diversity and inclusion, to include new colleagues from the IDD community, intellectually and developmentally disabled community. You know, when I saw the presentation, I seeing the numbers, it's such a stark reality when it's presented in such a powerful way. And it reminds me that, you know, JP Morgan as not only an employer, but also a service provider in all of these communities has a responsibility to continue to try to set the right example. You know, we're a leader in the industry that we're in, but we all have work to do, and we just have to continue to set the right example. The importance can't be underemphasized.
Great. Thank you, Brian. So Tom, I'd like to go to you as we look at inclusive community development. And, you know, one of the pieces that Nanette had shared was that in our research at NDI, it found that the net worth of individuals who are Black with a disability have a net worth of $1,282. And with your background in community development, I wonder if you could share some suggestions on how inclusive community development organizations, disability organizations, and financial institutions can be more responsive to these challenges.
One of the first things that has to be accomplished is that the groups themselves have to connect. So we have to have some sort of networking that takes place, and that could be anywhere from the financial institutions being able to set up an advisory panel that consists of those community groups that are advocates for the disability community, for community development organizations to have that intersection with the other two, so that they're looking at ways to actually begin to address not only financial wellness in terms of money management, so that individuals who do need to figure out how to live paycheck to paycheck can begin to work on savings and eventually investments. And so that's part of what needs to be done, is that ability to begin to actually have these groups talk with one another. One of the things that FDIC had done was to have listening sessions, and these were gatherings of individuals that would come and discuss for maybe an hour or so with the financial institutions, being able to then discuss what these organizations saw as their major challenges, what were their relationships with their financial institutions, and how they might begin to address those. So communication is going to be one of the keys to it, and then being able to actually craft ways to introduce savings and investment programs. And finally, the whole notion of whether or not individuals are banked in not using alternative financial services. So the fact that we've gone through the pandemic and the use of virtual and online and digital platforms, I think this is an opportunity for the financial institutions to figure out ways to actually do that kind of marketing outreach, so that they begin to penetrate the market and identify where they need to address the numbers of the under and unbanked, particularly when it relates to race and disability.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Perfect. So Donna, I want to go back to you for a minute, and looking at what your organization does and how it supports the disability community and the work that you all have done on this topic as well, is what suggestions do you have for community development opportunities for organizations to assure that we are eliminating the barriers of ableism and the barriers of racism?
Yes, thank you. On that topic, with our organization, we have reached out to partnering organizations that share a mission similar to ours in order to expand our reach. And so with that, we're building a network of people who are looking at and exploring solutions to this problem. As you indicated, we have had a similar conversation recently and engaged people who receive services, as well as those who are advocating, who work in the field, in order to come up with solutions. One of the things that was so clear to me is the need for timely information. I cannot tell you how many times I heard, we just didn't know. We didn't know this was an issue. And so I think having more conversations such as this, reaching out to audiences that go beyond those who serve people with disabilities or people who have disabilities, and creating some type of format so people get timely information. One of the things we're looking at doing right now is a list serve that will be for people with disabilities by people with disabilities in order for them to learn about some of the resources and the supports that exist. And in order to reach those who go beyond that community so that there is greater awareness, we will continue to host information meetings that engage those people who tend not to be on the front lines of working with those having a disability, and also putting out communications that get into the hands of those individuals.
Great, thank you, Donna. And that's a great idea about the listserv. So we look forward to learning more about that and sharing with others as well. A question that we want to look at, Brian, is, you talked about the BEST initiative or program that you all have at JPMorgan Chase, and looking at workforce development as a community development activity. What are strategies that you can suggest for workforce development programs that can assure the outreach and recruitment of Black, Indigenous, and people of color with disabilities is a part of those efforts?
Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an approach that we're using in Chicago. My program is expanding to Chicago. We're really excited about it. We've been centric to the Dallas-Fort Worth market. Now we're reaching out a little bit. So we use community partners. So you can think of career service or transition service nonprofits, but we also utilize universities with IDD certificate programs. So in the Chicago market, we have a partner who has an IDD certificate program at a local university, but we understand that the participants at that university, there may be a tuition barrier, there may be transportation barrier for access to that programming to possibly become an employee of JPMorgan. So to ensure that we have representation of the full community, we're also going to work with a community partner who sources exclusively from the public schools in that community. It is absolutely good for business to have complete representation of the community where our employees live, where we serve and work. So that strategy, recognizing that one sourcing channel may have certain barriers and may not be completely inclusive, and then identifying other sourcing channels that ensure we get the complete representation of that community. So that's one strategy that we utilize, Michael.
Great, thank you, Brian. And Brian, we are getting several requests about the BEST initiative, and I know we're going to send out a flyer, but do you have a link that you could put in the chat box for folks to go to it? We have several requests of asking where they can go to get more info.
Yeah, I think we'll do, Mike, because I don't have a link, but we do have some collateral that we shared that provides an overview of the program. And then I'm certainly available if someone reaches out to NDI to discuss the programming, and particularly for employers who are interested in this space, I would love to engage with them and talk about the opportunity. So I think we can include a couple of slides that has some more detail on the strategy and how the programming is structured in the material that will be sent out afterwards.
Okay, great, excellent. Yes, so anyone can email us at ask@ndi-inc.org, and we will make sure to follow up and get that information. And then we also hope to be able to share more in a session about that program as well. So as we're coming up on our time and we're getting some other questions, Lillian, I just want to go back to you for just a minute. You know, one of the pieces that you had mentioned is you gave us kind of this call to action of different pieces that you know we could do, and I just want to see if you could spend a minute or so to share with our audience, or what are suggestions on how the disability community's voice, now that we hear this data and have shared this, can be more involved in the work collectively, not only at Prosperity Now, but in local communities, as we work to build the awareness on the racial wealth divide. You know, we've heard that networking, communication, and timely info is key. So wonder if you have some suggestions as well on that topic.
Thank you, Parker. Thank you, Michael. The thing that I would add is, you know, a lot of my work really does focus on place-based efforts and how do we begin to actually build movement and a catalyst in community. So one of the things that I would really want to offer here is there's so much power in administrative policy change at the local level. To have the most immediate impact on the lives of folks living in those communities. And I know that information in the pandemic hasn't really allowed for us to be actually physically in community with other people. So I think it's important in this moment to figure out what issues you care about and do some deep dive efforts, right? Trying to figure out what's present in your respective community to help carry that torch. And also, the other thing I'll add is I don't think that there's an all or some game, right? Sometimes, you know, we don't necessarily join coalitions because the issues that they're actually focusing on isn't necessarily the issue that's important to us. But I just want to name that I think there's always power in being able to build a popular narrative, as long as you have the people who are willing to support that. So, and I think that I'll give a prime example, right? So the issues of folks that we work with in Miami, in the Latino community may be very different than the issues that folks work on in New Orleans, but how you advocate and the strategies that are used to push for administrative policy changes at the local level could be very similar and useful. So I just want to name that, just because the coalition group or the local group isn't necessarily championing your issue, don't think that there's something that you can't learn about how you actually move advocacy and policy from being a part of that group or associated with that group.
Great, thank you, Lillian. I think one of the pieces that I take away from this is really about how we do, as we have these strong coalitions and advocacy groups from the disability community at the local level, and we have groups that are working on this, is how we bridge that and really bring our advocacy together. So I think that that's a key takeaway. So thank you for that. We have like 2 more minutes, but I just want to ask, Donna, building on that piece about the coalitions and knowing the work that you shared about incorporating, you know, bringing individuals, can you really quickly give a suggestion on how organizations can bring individuals with disabilities into this conversation to really be a part of the advocacy on the racial wealth divide work?
Absolutely. One of the things we do within our organizations, we have an advisory group. And when promoting and soliciting membership for that advisory group, we specifically recruited people who have disabilities, who have firsthand knowledge of some of these issues and who are able to guide us in some of the decisions that we make, some of the policies that we develop. They're part of they're part of our board. They're an ongoing part of the conversations that take place through our organization. Here recently, they advised us on addressing the digital divide, and in response, help come up with some funds in order to do that within our system. So having people in the front line who know best is one way to do that.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Donna. But we had a lot of other questions, but unfortunately we are at our time. I think today we really laid the foundation. We have this overview. We've shared the disability data that we have. We have some thoughts on what the solutions or what activities can be. Again, I think communication, networking, timely info, get beneath the data at the local level, and really have those conversations that will then move on up. So I think these are some great takeaways and some great next steps that we can look at collectively. Again, we had over 790 folks register for this webinar today, so that shows us that this is really an important conversation that we've been working on as well as others, and we're really grateful to really be able to have this conversation with you and sharing this information. We would like to say that thank you again to JP Morgan Chase for sponsoring the Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development, for recognizing the importance of disability inclusive community development, and for sponsoring today's webinar and supporting today's webinar to bring us all together to have this conversation. I would like to thank each of our presenters and each of our panelists. Thank you so much to Denise Steele. Thank you to Lillian Singh. Thank you to Nanette Goodman. Thank you to our panel members, Donna Coulter, Tom Stokes, and Brian Gill. Please note, this isn't the last you've heard from them, because we will take your questions and answer them and get those sent out with the follow-up items. If you'd like more information on the Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development and some of our upcoming activities, please go to cdicd.org. After the webinar, if you have additional questions or comments, please send an email to ask@ndi-inc.org. And my final thank you, I'd like to thank the team at the National Disability Institute. Thanks to Al and Hope behind the scenes, our communications team, as well as the CDICD team for helping to put this all together. With that, I hope everybody has a great day, and thank you again for spending your afternoon with us.